Truth is making a comeback. America's Top Stories with Leesa Donner.
There is no doubt about it. The recent spate of shootings means the Second Amendment is under fire. Lawmakers will be ending their summer recess early to take up so-called red flag rules. And Parkland High School students are understandably up in arms over gun violations, but their prescription for a solution seems more than a bit heavy-handed. There's a lot to discuss, and Second Amendment supporters have a lot to worry about. So let's get right to it. Joining us now to hash out the potential due process quagmire with red flag laws, as well as the heavy-handed Parkland student proposal, is constitutional attorney and Liberty Nation legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza, Esquire. Thanks for joining us on Truth is Making a Comeback, Scott.
Thank you for having me, Lisa.
All right, so let's begin with the red flag laws, which would call for the confiscation of a person's firearms if they're deemed at risk. What's the problem with that?
Well, there are a multitude of problems with it. Chief among them is that they allow for the removal of a fundamental right without what would we traditionally be known as due process of law.
Well, in my article, I did point out this week that red flag legislation is loaded with gray areas that call for assumptions on the part of law enforcement, judges, and mental health professionals. In other words, who gets to define who is mentally unstable? What rubric do they use? What are the potential legal pitfalls here?
Well, these are only state laws at this time, so we can't just say they are one thing, because every different state has a different law. But generally speaking, this is those decisions are made by a judge with the guidance of the law that usually says that the people are maybe a danger to themselves or others.
All right, but what are the judges essentially looking at? Who comes before them, and what are they asking them to do?
Well, that's an excellent question. It's the moving party who brings that information to a judge, and those moving parties, in other words, the person who wishes to see another denied of their right to keep and bear arms, that could be a person who lives with them, a person that works with them, or a government official like a police officer or even a teacher.
Okay, that reminds me of something I brought up in the article, and that is, if I'm living with you and your guns are confiscated, then, at least in California at this point, my guns are confiscated too.
There are more issues than we can count, Lisa, as we peel back the onion on these red flag laws. They're not just a bad idea for one reason. They're a bad idea for many reasons. And like you say, you could have a child, for instance. You could have a son who was an adult who lived at home and was subject to a red flag law. And meanwhile, you could have somebody who is subject to, stalking, for instance, and maybe it was the stalker who called in the red flag law. The potential for abuse here, to say nothing of, by the way, spouses and former intimates, when they get at each other, unfortunately, abuse of the legal process is de rigueur.
Well, as usual, you're getting ahead of me. So I was wondering about the potential abuse of the system. Let's just say we have a scorned wife or husband, and they decide to get even, and they concoct a story about their soon-to-be ex. So one or the other hires a lawyer to seek a court order and to have the other person's gun rights taken away, or their guns, let's put it that way. So now it's up to a judge to decide ex parte. Explain to us what that means.
Well, ex parte just means without the party to be charged against. In other words, it's you don't have the right to be informed that there's basically a case against you and your rights. In the hypothetical you mentioned, let's say it's a former spouse or current spouse heading to be a former spouse, and that typically is what we see with sort of abuse claims that are basically abused and not forthright. And basically what happens is the party goes to court and says so-and-so shouldn't have a gun because they're crazy, they're violent, they're threatening. And that person in many of these jurisdictions with these red flag laws does not even have the right to defend themselves at the hearing, which will define their rights going forward. That's what an ex parte proceeding is, and it's why it's anathema, Lisa, to any kind of historical notions of due process and liberty and freedom.
All right, so when regular people talk about due process, I wonder if they understand what you lawyers say about due process. Can you extrapolate on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, well, it's a nebulous term. Even within the law itself, there are different types of due process. There's substantive due process and procedural due process. And in this instance, we're talking about, at the very least, procedural due process, which is that you should get notice that there's going to be a hearing that will decide your Second Amendment rights in the near term and in the long term, laying out your rights and what you can do to respond to this information, and then present a defense, so that you could defend your own right to keep and bear arms, as if a fundamental right needs to be defended against is kind of putting the cart before the horse, but that's the nuts and bolts of it.
All right, so in a nutshell, your case against red flag laws.
They won't help anything. They'll be misused, and they will basically be a cudgel for chiefly angry women to use against men, because while present company may be excluded, vast majority of firearms ownership in this country is by males. And I believe, having spent a great deal of time in the domestic abuse courts representing women who wish to seek protection from abuse orders, I saw in that court not the majority of cases, but a significant minority of cases of women using that process in order to gain advantage in financial negotiations or custody negotiations. And I expect the same if red flag laws become more prominent.
Oh my, you're going to be called a sexist.
Well, they're going to call me something, so whatever.
Now, quickly onto Parkland High School. I find it somewhat troubling that our young people seem hell-bent on reducing their own right to bear arms. These Parkland students have been through a horrible situation, but what are they proposing for a solution?
They're proposing a host of laws that will result in basically elimination of private firearms ownership in the United States, with the exception of some very few wealthy collectors. That's their goal.
So we're looking at more draconian laws, essentially? That's what we're talking about?
Well, I'll run it down for you very quickly. A total ban on what they call assault weapons, which seems to be almost any modern semi-automatic rifle, combined with a massive taxpayer-funded, quote-unquote, buyback of other privately held firearms, combined with onerous, ongoing licensing and regulation restrictions, including annual classes and training that need to be taken by the gun owner.
So more of these laws aren't likely to stop deranged shooters, just as banning knives isn't going to stop stabbings. So why do we as a nation, and these children specifically, continue to put the emphasis on the wrong syllable?
Well, I think that it's a natural reaction when to look for an easy solution to a problem. And this is the intuitive, I think, solution. It takes a more of a two-step or more step thinking in order to understand that just simply banning these guns won't result in fewer guns available to people who are willing to violate the law or wish to commit violent acts.
So historically and globally speaking, do fewer guns mean fewer shootings?
You know, Lisa, there's a sort of a famous book in this policy area called More Guns, Less Crime by John Lott, who's an economist. And there are other studies that are put forth by the gun grabbing crowd that show globally that some of the opposite is true. And I think that the real number for social science is, can we rely on any of these studies to say definitively yes or no, one way or the other? And I think the answer to that question is no. It's not like whether fluoride is an effective preventative for tooth decay. We can determine that scientifically. I don't think this social science is clear enough. We don't have the data set to understand, whether we can answer that question one way or another.
Thank you. That's Scott Cosenza, Legal Affairs Editor for LibertyNation.com. Thanks so much for joining us today, Scott.
Thank you, Lisa.
Truth is making a comeback. Visit us at LibertyNation.com.